So my role is to make some wise comments on Jerry's presentation, but I will try to put a spin on what actually is happening in the emerging markets and also what happened in Asia, 1997-98. So Jerry apologized for bringing a history of 10 years ago, but I apologize more for talking about 20 years ago events. But I think it's the issues which we discussed 20 years ago are still relevant and still not completely solved because of inherent philosophical differences in IMF and around the major countries. So Jerry had some pictures, so I have more pictures. So this is Bretton Woods, and this is a hotel. White building is a hotel called Mount Washington Hotel, where those Bretton Woods meetings in 1944, July, it took place. Now, this is room, the plaque on the door of the room where Articles of Agreement, which is like Constitution of IMF, was signed. So this is sort of the place in the history that which should be remembered. So if you have time in East Coast in the U.S., please go up to New Hampshire and visit this hotel. Beautiful golf course during the summer and beautiful ski resorts during the winter. So more seriously, I would summarize Jerry's presentation that IMF does not have any influence on big countries like US, Europe, Japan, and China. Basically, those big shareholders, they are the shareholders of the IMF and IMF staff comes, and they listen to the views, discuss the issues, but they never listen to the advice of IMF. So that Jerry says the staff or IMF doesn't have any traction. Traction means influence or leverage on how those big countries may change the policies. They never change policies because of the IMF advice. But IMF has an important role and influences on emerging market economies when emerging market economies fall into crisis. So that comes Jerry's presentation's title, A Good Crisis. And there is saying, Jerry didn't mention it, but there is a saying in the IMF and the World Bank, crisis is the window of opportunities to have the emerging markets or the borrowing countries to do right policies, window of opportunity. So they want to utilize this timing of crisis to have them change the policies and make the economies more robust, better, or correct. Okay? The question is whether IMF is doing the right advice. IMF is giving right advice, and IMF give the right tools and incentives for those emerging market economies. And as Jerry briefly touched on, the many Asian countries still, after 20 years, feel that they're mistreated and they were given the wrong advice during the crisis of 1997-98. And Jerry mentioned IMF learned the lessons from those Asian crises, mishandling of the Asian countries, but Asian countries still have some doubts that they'll be treated correctly in the next crisis if it happens in Asia. So they try to avoid any vulnerability that may lead to a crisis. The problem that IMF had in 1987-98 when they faced the Asian currency crisis was that they didn't realize that the type of crisis that they were dealing with was quite different from a crisis in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and first half of 1990s. One exception, one precedent of Asian type of crisis was Mexico 1994. And IMF didn't learn enough lessons from Mexico to apply to Thailand and Indonesia and Korea. The issue was that the Mexico and also Asia crisis happened because of they borrowed too much in short term, and that was much bigger than what they could handle if those capital flows out very quickly. Okay, the old type traditional crisis was in the current account deficit or trade deficits, that they imported more than they could than exports, and they sort of gradually exhausted their foreign reserves. The foreign reserve changes due to trade deficit was gradual, and they have time to reverse and build up after the right policies are taken. But that was the old type of crisis. In the capital account crisis, the capital comes in massive, but could flow out massively overnight, and they could exhaust foreign reserves overnight, basically. So how to cope with those very volatile short-term capital flows was the question, and is a question still. And basically, IMF made a mistake, and we still have some doubts whether IMF could cope with or give the right advice if the next crisis comes. But it may not be a IMF staff's problem. I have sympathy to IMF staff. And staff may give the right advice, but the shareholders, big shareholders, may oppose to the staff's right advice. So that's the internal governance problem. I'll come back to that in the end. Okay, so Jerry mentioned that IMF role of IMF is surveillance, that give a right advice, do the right analysis, have a good discussions, and the basically the right objective analyst and talk to the authorities. Also, IMF does to do that, you need a good data. So data collection and dissemination is also a very important part of the IMF. Now, the another role is, of course, lending money during the crisis. So this part is the sort of the parts that some staff really get excited to write the program. What are the conditions and how much to lend? And those are the exciting part of the IMF. Basically, this is a window of opportunity to change the country. Now, when crisis happens in the emerging market, then you have to know whether what crisis is based on the fundamental problems of the macroeconomic policy and financial markets policy, that you have to really change the policies to get out, or liquidity crisis, which could happen even on the rumor of some false rumor, fake news in the language of Trump, that which may cause the investors to pull out the money. So analogy is just think about a bank, commercial bank, on the streets, and commercial bank could go into a crisis if they had bad assets and they become insolvent. Okay, the capital is depleted, then that is a genuine fundamental crisis, insolvency crisis. Okay, that's what solvency crisis means. You exhaust capital. In the case of a country, you exhaust foreign reserves. That's a solvency crisis. Analogy of liquidity crisis in the commercial banking is that suppose some rumor starts that this bank A is insolvent, but actually it is solvent. But rumor has it, and all the depositors come to the window next day and demand deposit to be withdrawn, paid out, then bank doesn't have cash. Why? Because bank has already lent to the companies, and you cannot recall those loans overnight. But depositors can demand deposit to be withdrawn overnight. Then bank becomes sort of insolvent because you cannot meet the depositor's demand. But on the balance sheet, they have assets, good assets, but it takes time to get those assets into the cash to be paid out to depositors. Same thing in the emerging market. If all the hedge funds and the investors around the world demand all those lending and investment to be paid back, investment like equities and bank deposits and bank lending, wholesale lending to the bank to be withdrawn overnight, then country doesn't have the foreign reserves. Countries have assets, but it takes time to liquidate those assets and send back so that they paid to the investors. So liquidity crisis means that country has the assets, a commercial bank assets, but it takes time to liquidate those assets and pay back to those who demands the deposit to be paid out or the foreign reserves, foreign assets to be paid back. Okay, the policies to deal with solvency crisis and liquidity crisis should be different, right? So solvency crisis, you have to change the policies. You have to change. Maybe you have to ask the central bank governor or minister of finance to really change the policies. You have to put conditions how to deal with those money losing government state-owned corporations and so on. Fundamental change in policies is needed in solvency crisis. Liquidity crisis, in theory, you can lend money to the country, and country pay back all those capital outflow and take time to get those assets to be sent back to the country. And you can repay later to the emergency lender, basically in this case the IMF. In the case of banking crisis, central bank can lend to commercial bank emergency loans, and commercial banks, since they have the assets, they can sell, liquidate, and pay back to the central bank, and fine. So no policy change is needed. But just to lend money, no condition, massively, and by time. Okay, so this is a theory, right? So solvency crisis and liquidity crisis are different, and they require different policies. Okay. So Thailand, was it a solvency crisis or liquidity crisis? Indonesia, was it a solvency crisis and liquidity crisis? Korea, was it a solvency crisis and liquidity crisis? That was the central question in 1997 and may happen next year in somewhere in the world. When emerging market goes into crisis, you have to know whether that's solvency crisis or liquidity crisis. Okay? So, as I said, this is theory, black and white. But in practice, in the real world, there's no black and white distinction. But it's a continuum of the different shades of gray, right? So that's where you have to make a decision, judgment, that how much conditions that IMF should require on the emerging market to change the policy. How much in size, how much money you want to lend to a emerging market economy. How quickly you want to give the money, loan the money to the emerging market. If it's a pure liquidity crisis, you should not put any condition on the loan. Just lend massively, quickly, big in size, and that will solve the liquidity crisis. Okay? In the case of the solvency crisis, you want to put all those policy conditions that you have to change this and that, and the lend slowly in the installments, that if you do this, I'll lend you this. If you do that, I'll lend you more. And those kind of installments, which is called tranche in IMF. And 3-year planning to how to really change the policy. Okay? So those are the differences, and that's the theory. But there is a sort of bias in IMF that the crisis is a window of opportunity. We should take time to really change the policies, and this is a good time to change. So they have a bias to put more conditions than may be necessary. And they would withhold lending too much, because if you lend too much in the up front, then the countries lose the incentive to change. Okay? So that's the sort of bias if there's a continuum of gray on the part of the IMF. And I think the Asian crisis, it was this bias was made in a dramatically bad way. Okay, so so if we knew that in Thailand and Indonesia, that size was probably too small compared to the liabilities that the country had. So we said, why don't you lend more? Okay. Then the IMF said, as Jerry mentioned, there is something called access limit, that Thailand could borrow only 5 times of the quota. Quota is like the share that they put into the IMF. So 3 times or 5 times at that point was not too big compared to how much Thailand borrowed in short-term loans from outside. So access limit was excused that they couldn't, IMF couldn't lend to Thailand. But of course, after failures to stop the crisis in Thailand and Indonesia, IMF changed the rule and found ways to lend 20 times of the quota to Korea, which helped to partly help the Korea to stop the crisis. It was not the end of the crisis, but the buy time more. Okay. Now, so again, the quick disbursement is the key to stop the liquidity crisis, but which means that you don't have the time to see whether this is solvency crisis or liquidity crisis, what kind of policies are needed to turn around the country. So IMF has a bias. Well, let's try to examine these economies and see what kind of policy changes are needed and so on. So that try to slow down those quick disbursement. But the bonds is due next week, and you don't have time. And that's the sort of the trade-off, that quick disbursement versus the good surveillance. Okay, so and another thing is a front-loading. So you have the big size loan program, but again, the bias is that you want to make it in installments. And so first installment is so small that it doesn't make any difference if it is a liquidity crisis. So those are the issues, tensions of the emerging market crisis. And since I don't have time, so to differentiate, so some people actually do not believe this distinction of solvency crisis and liquidity crisis. Some people believe that there is no such thing as a liquidity crisis. All the crisis has reasons that they have to change. But many Asians believe that, yes, there are two types of crisis, solvency crisis and liquidity crisis. When I was writing, some recommendations and reform recommendations and so on, I had a big fight with some people who do not believe in the existence of liquidity crisis. So there is a big tension among the researchers and policymakers that whether there is such thing as the pure liquidity crisis. But but we are, I think, winning. That there are cases to think about the liquidity crisis, and the compromise between these two camps is that, well, maybe we can think of a way to certify which country is good enough to say this is a good country, and if it goes in crisis, it is by spillover from other countries or crisis, negative influence, or the fake news or rumors that this country is in crisis and going to crisis for no good reason. Okay? So how to make a certification that this country is good if they fall into a situation that capital is flowing out very quickly, will lend massively, quickly, and no condition. Okay, so IMF is now half agreeing that there is a case for liquidity crisis, but solution is don't wait until crisis happens, but we pre-certify that country is good enough, and this country goes into a crisis, then that is liquidity crisis. Okay, so then you have to struggle how to make a pre-certification, and what if the after 6 months of pre-certification, the country may fall into a bad solvency crisis, fundamental problems. So how long can you keep this pre-certification? If you pre-certify the country and decertify 6 months later, that will trigger a crisis. So IMF does not want to trigger a crisis. So pre-certification has a risk of decertification and crisis. What to do is that. So this is a list of the acronyms. Nobody can spell out acronyms, even in IMF staff. But a series of those facilities that they struggled to differentiate solvency crisis and liquidity crisis and try to help the liquidity crisis. But always this pre-certification part is a problem, and how much, with condition or without condition, how quickly, front-loaded or not. And they all, I would say, fail. There aren't many takers of those facilities. And the latest attempt, which again failed to establish, was short-term liquidity swap. And some Asian countries complained, and the compromise was struck. But then at that time, the US really opposed to this SLS, and it didn't go into the existence. Some of the early attempts, they set up the facility, but no takers, because they felt that applying for it is to show the weakness. Okay, so this problem or tension between solvency crisis and liquidity crisis still exists, and how to separate, distinguish those, and try to help only liquidity crisis with massive, quick loans without conditions. That is the unsolved question. Okay? So I'll skip all those. And this explains why SLS failed. So I will end with some of the commercials, advertisement. So this is the book I wrote with my friends in 1999, right after the Asian crisis and Russian crisis. Angry more about Russian crisis, that staff recommendation was overruled by some big shareholder and lent to Russia with soft conditions. And that was also viewed by the Asians that it was kind of double standard. Why were you so strict and severe to Asia? Now you're too soft on Russia. So we had some views about maybe staff view should be owner. Staff should be independent from big shareholders. That was what independence here means. Now, 20 years later, we wrote, the same co-authors wrote another book, and we said, Unfinished Agenda, that all those things we pointed out 20 years ago was not solved yet. And we pointed out some of those liquidity crisis issue and so on. Another report is this called G20 Eminent Persons Group report. And this covers both IMF and World Bank. But this was commissioned by G20, so this is good connections to a series title. And we covered many issues, so I cannot really summarize one here. But again, we had discussions on how to deal with the liquidity crisis. And just one word about G20. So Jerry mentioned the G20 summit was created right after the Lehman Brothers collapse and on the verge of the depression. But G20 finance ministers and governors meeting was created after Asian crisis. So 1999, that Asians complained that their quota was too small, their voices are not heard, and crises were mishandled, and Asians complained, and we need a forum that our voices are bigger. And that made this G20 came into being. So if you look at which countries are in G20, it reveals some interesting facts that more Asians and the geographical balance and less Europeans. So just study the list of G20, and actually there are only 19 countries in G20, and GDP ranking, size ranking, as of 1999. That will reveal the why G20 was created. G20 summit, they took the list from G20 finance ministers and governors meeting. So that is 1999 list. And they just created, upgraded, higher level meeting. And so that's the history of G20. Thank you.